Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Alexandra Palmer. I'm a Senior Curator in the Royal Ontario Museum, and I work in the Department of Global Fashion and Textiles. Today, I'm going to talk with Dr. Brendan Edwards, who's our Head Librarian at the Royal Ontario Museum. Morning, Brendan.
Good morning, Alexandra.
So people may not understand that as a fashion curator, I work with objects, obviously, but the other objects I work with a lot and I rely on intensely for everything I do are the books, magazines, archives, as well as people like Brendan, librarians who help me desperately with everything that we're doing.
Well, the ROM Library and Archives is meant to support the research of museum staff, including curators like yourself. We're also accessible to the public, normally in-house. We don't loan material out to the public, but the public under normal circumstances could come into the museum and visit the library's reading room to make use of our collections. Now, of course, right now, our physical collections have been cut off from us, so we've been relying very heavily on digital resources. So I've been assisting ROM staff as well as our public through digital means to answer questions as best as possible, to try to provide access to books and articles where possible in digital format. I've also taken this opportunity to begin collecting some interesting print responses to the COVID-19 epidemic, and in particular, the responses of fashion magazines.
From the 18th century, we have examples of fashion magazines that really, when they began, as we know them today, and came a very important part of print culture, and of course exploded over the 19th century and 20th century. And now it's kind of a different issue. They might be in jeopardy with the so-called death of print, but that's not true, is it, Brendan?
I'm not so sure that we could say that print is dead. I think print is going to live for a while yet. There's still a lot of material that's published only in print, or if it is published digitally, it's published digitally very briefly, and then of course it disappears with the next new content. So there's a challenge to archive digital creation and digital publishing.
So what's been happening recently from your desk at home with the COVID pandemic?
Well, I have begun looking at fashion magazines' responses to the COVID pandemic, and there have been some very interesting and quite dramatic responses. And I'll preface this by saying that under normal circumstances, fashion magazines rely heavily on photography, on makeup artists, on on-location photography shoots, etc. And right now, they're not able to do that, of course. There are travel restrictions, there are, of course, social distancing, and fashion magazines have had a challenge in front of them in terms of presenting content. So I have some examples of some fashion magazines that I have acquired in recent months. And to start with, I'll show you sort of what we were looking at prior to the pandemic and prior to lockdowns. We see here 3 examples of Elle France from early 2020, prior to the pandemic and prior to lockdown, typical of what you would expect from a fashion magazine. And here is Elle Canada prior to the lockdown, prior to things changing in early March or mid-March. But now we'll see that both Elle France and Elle Canada have had responses to the pandemic. And here are a couple of quite dramatic responses. On the left, you see Elle France, and on the right, you see Elle Canada.
And Elle France, it almost looks like a repeat textile pattern. And of course, there's no real people. There's
You're
drawings.
quite right. Yeah, that's an illustration meant to pay tribute and to say thank you to the frontline, notably all female staff, doctors and nurses, paramedics.
And multiracial here, we don't have one type.
That's true. That's quite right. And Elle Canada's response is perhaps simpler. It's a plain white cover with only a very limited amount of text, and the expression "alone together, united in hope."
With the maple leaf.
Yes. And that second letter in the L logo has been dropped to represent social distancing.
Very nice, fantastic graphics.
Mm-hmm. I want to move to the fashion magazine response in Italy, if we may. Italy, of course, has been hit very, very hard by the pandemic, and their fashion magazine output has responded in interesting ways. Here are 3 examples of Vanity Fair Italia prior to the pandemic. So here are covers from early 2020. Here we see 4 responses from Vanity Fair Italia since the pandemic has begun. The first example is of a real-life lung specialist who's working on the front lines at a hospital. The second is the Italian flag, of course, cut down the middle, and that cut is meant to represent a wound or a break in our normal lives. The third cover is by a French photographer, Jean René, and if you look carefully, the street is quite empty with the exception of the one young girl. And if you look up into the buildings, you'll see people peering out their windows in social isolation. And the fourth cover is meant to be a dreamlike perspective on what will life look like after the lockdown is lifted. Moving to the UK and Grazia UK. Grazia UK is a weekly magazine, and here are a couple of examples of what that magazine typically looked like before the pandemic began. And here we have 4 examples of a single issue of Grazia UK from April 2020. These 4 covers were released simultaneously, and each depicts a real-life NHS frontline worker, a doctor, a nurse, a paramedic, and these photographs were taken in a car park outside of a hospital.
Right, so socially distancing, no makeup artist, this is life.
That's right, and here are the women on the front lines. Vogue has had some interesting covers as well, and the first cover that, in terms of response to the COVID-19 pandemic, was Vogue Italia's issue for April 2020. It's plain white with absolutely no text except for the Vogue logo.
Which has been faded out, like it's in fact less important than it used to be.
That's right, and this magazine came out right at the beginning of the big crisis in Italy, and this was a response that had to happen very quickly. And it's also, I think, a very emotional response to the reality.
Mm-hmm.
Vogue US, with their latest issue just released for June 2020, has also responded with a white cover with a single red rose.
But April, May, June is still a big time lag. I mean, this is what's going on in the world. Is reality is hitting in different ways and at different times.
That's right. The timelines are very interesting to take note of here. Here are 6 additional covers of magazines that I have acquired for the ROM library and will be in our collections, in our rare book collections, I'll add. And the reason these are going into rare books is it will be quite difficult to acquire these magazines after all is said and done. Under normal circumstances, magazines tend to be throwaway. You don't typically hold on to them for very long. You might give them to your kids to cut up, or they end up in your recycling bin. So it can be difficult to get past issues of magazines, and I think these will be particularly difficult to acquire. So these will go into our rare book collections.
Fantastic.
I wanted to finish with a brief discussion about Vogue Portugal's response in their April 2020 issue. They released 2 covers of the April 2020 issue of Vogue Portugal, and this is one of those covers which I have been able to acquire.
It's super fashiony compared to some of the others. It's definitely staged and elegant.
But then if we look at the second cover that Vogue Portugal released, this is quite different than typical Vogue cover with the face masks. And I should say that I haven't been able to acquire this one. This is already very, very difficult to get your hands on. So if any of our viewers today might happen to have a copy of this, and you would be so generous as to offer it to the ROM library, I'd certainly like to hear from you.
So Brendan, I know this is a brief overview of what you've been doing in COVID on women's fashion magazines, but the ROM also has a fabulous collection of men's magazines, including Gentry with tipped in bits of textile and accessories, really wonderful magazine. And we look forward to getting back to the museum, to the archives, to actually physically handling these wonderful books. And often even just going through the library shelf, it's not the book you're looking for, but it's the one next to that that's the one that becomes the most interesting. So nothing like actually being in the library.
That's right.
So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexandra. And I'll finish our brief discussion today with this cover of GQ Portugal, which is a men's magazine. And again, this is a response to the current pandemic.